Councillor, just to say that the Act is hugely concerning and the impact it's going to have on people who are non-Irish and British citizens but otherwise living on the island of Ireland, but particularly on those seeking asylum and people being trafficked. And we hear about a lot of people being trafficked into Britain and then across to the north for whether it's forced labour or whether it's for sexual exploitation. And those people are very vulnerable and need the supports put in place. And the fact that they can actually be detained and then just sent back to the country that they came from, where the issues arose in the first place, where they've been already trafficked from, is very concerning. And I'm just wondering, is there anything can be done? I mean, I presume Britain is a signatory to the 51 Refugee Convention. So is there anything can be done in relation to that convention, the fact that this Act is clearly in breach of the convention?
So, I mean, I think there's a very good point made around, particularly on victims of trafficking. We haven't really touched on that too much today. I think I mentioned it in the opening remarks. But again, in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, which again, the UK is a signatory to, Article 4 of the European Convention provides for an absolute right prohibiting slavery and forced labour, and one of the EU directives, which again is still retained EU law in Northern Ireland, the 2011 Trafficking Directive, sets out minimum standards in preventing and combating trafficking in human beings and protecting victims. And one of the particularly odious aspects of this legislation is the removal of rights and protections from victims of trafficking and a refusal to even entertain or to consider people's sort of complaints about being victims of trafficking, that they too can find themselves caught up in this legislation, whose sole objective is to remove people from the UK to Rwanda or to another third country or back to their country of origin. And so again, if we look at the Human Rights Commission's legislation and the case that they will be bringing to the High Court in Belfast in January, they're quite clear that this legislation breaches those rights, both under the European Convention of Human Rights and under the 2011 EU law for victims of trafficking. And again, if they are successful, there could be some sort of carve-out or some sort of relief given with respect to victims of trafficking in Northern Ireland, but it doesn't solve, obviously, the wider problem for victims of trafficking across the UK. So in terms of the Refugee Convention, again, the whole purpose and design of this legislation is for the UK to sidestep its international obligations under the 1951 UN Convention. So while they remain signatories to it, they are trying to step outside its obligations. The whole idea is that all countries are obliged to sort of collectively shoulder the responsibility of people who find themselves having to flee persecution or conflict or climate crisis. And it's the UK saying, no, we are here on the western fringes of Europe. We want to have a hard border and not allow anybody in. It would be a different matter, perhaps, if they created safe and legal routes, but they don't. So apart from a very few examples around, say, Afghanistan, the Ukraine scheme, also Hong Kong, otherwise, people have no safe and legal routes, are forced to take to boats and other forms of travel which put them in jeopardy, and therefore find themselves at the harsh end of this new piece of legislation that they are deemed to have travelled unlawfully, entered the country unlawfully, and therefore de facto are refused the possibility of claiming asylum. That's what is now outlawed by this piece of legislation. So how does one hold the UK to account under the UN Refugee Convention? It's a tough one in terms of there are obviously UN regular periodic reporting mechanisms. There's special rapporteur on refugee and migrant rights. So there are means to do that, but it ultimately is at a high degree of discretion of the UK, and the UK seems to be willing to sort of brazen it out at the moment, the idea that they are in breach of their international law obligations. I mean, we saw that previously around Northern Ireland when they talked about being able to break international law in sort of particular specific circumstances or particular specific ways. Again, that's what they are doing at the moment. And some of the rhetoric that surrounds this is deeply worrying, because it is undermining it more broadly of the international human rights framework. And other countries do and will look at the UK to say, well, if they can sidestep their international law obligations, why can't we? And there isn't really a good answer to that. And it's we are tied together in terms of these international legal responsibilities. And once there start to be breakages, particularly from countries like the UN, like the UK, a UN Permanent Security Council member, etc., I think we're into very troubled waters.